Hello, dear friends. Today, on lesson 6, titled Understanding Sacrifice, I welcome you one and all. Friends, our study. This is Elder Fungai Murambiwa, the host. Dear friends, we encourage you to help us spread this video by doing the work of an evangelist and making a difference by liking our program. You help, you help us spread and boost its ratings. More people are going to hear the content. So, dear friends, we would like to hear your thoughts. Just drop them in the comment section just below. Best of all is for you to subscribe to our channel and click on the notification icon to be alerted for more video uploads. May God bless you as you watch and listen to this presentation on lesson 6. On Sabbath afternoon, I encourage you to read for this week's study the following Bible chapters: Isaiah chapter 1 from verse 2 to 15. Hebrews chapter 10 from verse 3 to 10, Exodus 12 from verse 1 to 11, and 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7. And also the book of Haggai chapter 2 from verse 7 to 9, Isaiah chapter 6 from verses 1 to 5, and the book of Revelation from chapter 4 verses 7 to 11. Our memory text is coming from Revelation chapter 5 verse 9, which says, "Then they sang a new song, saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain and have redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation.'" That's our memory text, dear friends. When Jesus came toward him, John the Baptist declared, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." This is from John chapter 1, verse 29. This was an unmistakable reference to the idea of animal sacrifice, all of which pointed to Christ's substitutionary death in behalf of all humanity. In the Bible, we cannot escape the theme of animal sacrifice. It runs like a scarlet thread throughout its pages and plays a central role in the grand scene in Revelation, where John is escorted into God's throne room. See Revelation 4 and Revelation chapter 5. The fact that Jesus appears in this pivotal scene looking like a slain lamb, as in Revelation chapter 5 verse 6, is an important key to understanding the entire prophetic episode. This week, dear friends, we will look at some of the themes of sacrifice that inform our understanding of Jesus, the slain lamb, the clear protagonist of the throne room scene. He is accepted as worthy when no one else is, and his unique worthiness speaks volumes about what the Lord was doing through the sacrificial system. It reveals him as a God of infinite love who made the ultimate sacrifice, an act that we and other intelligences in the universe will marvel at for eternity. So, dear friends, study this week's lesson to prepare for Sabbath 10 May. Let's move on. Let's go on to Sunday. We have the subtopic, a question called futile sacrifices. Sometimes contrasting two ideas can be very much instructive. Much can be learned about the nature of sacrifice in the biblical perspective from when God actually rejected the sacrifices of his people. Let's compare this from Isaiah chapter 2, verse chapter 1, I mean to say, from verse 2 to 15, and Isaiah 56, verse 6 to 7, and Psalm chapter 51, verse 17. Here's the question, dear friends. What important lessons about sacrifice are taught here? What a mind-boggling question, isn't it, dear friends? This tragic episode in Israel's history was not the first time that God rejected a sacrifice. Something similar happened near the beginning of salvation's history, when Abel's sacrifice was approved and acknowledged by God, and Cain's was not. That early episode gives us another opportunity to contrast acceptable and unacceptable sacrifice. So, dear friends, let's read, so to say, seek Genesis chapter 4, verse 3 to 7, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4. In Isaiah's time, Israel was going through the motions, mentally checking off religious boxes in a minimal attempt to appease God, all while living as they pleased. Their sacrifices were anchored in self, just as Cain's were, and not in an attitude of surrender and submission to God. It is the same spirit that animates the kingdoms of this world, the spirit of self sufficiency. Cain would live as he pleased and render mere ritual to God on his own terms. One can only assume that he viewed God as an inconvenience, a roadblock to setting his own course. But he feared God just enough to go through the motions. Abel, dear friends, however, offered the sacrifice God had requested, the sacrifice that exhibited the promise God had made of a coming Messiah. See Galatians chapter 3, verse 15. A lamp pointing forward to the saving act of Christ at Calvary. Abel grasped the great principles of redemption. He saw himself a sinner, and he saw sin and its penalty, death, standing between his soul and communion with God. He brought the slain victim, the sacrificed life, thus acknowledging the claims of the law that had been transgressed. Through the shed blood, he looked to the future sacrifice, Christ dying on the cross of Calvary, and trusting in the atonement that was there to be made. He had the witness that he was righteous and his offering accepted. Ellen G. White, Patterns in Proverbs, page 72. How crucial that we protect ourselves from simply going through the motions. How can each one of us experience what it means to depend totally upon the death of Jesus as our only hope of salvation? What a pertinent and relevant question, isn't it, dear friends? Let's move on. On Monday, we have the subtopic, the blood of bulls and goats. Some have criticized the entire concept of sacrifice, claiming that it is cruel, harsh, and in a sense unfair. Yes, that's precisely the point. Christ's death was cruel, harsh, and unfair. The innocent dying for the guilty. That's what it took to solve the sin problem. And Christ's death was what all these harsh, cruel, and unfair sacrifices pointed to. Read Hebrews chapter 10 from verse 3 to 10. What does this passage teach us about the sacrifices God's people offered in the Old Testament? If sinners would only be saved by them, why offer them at all? The lambs and other sacrificial animals were mere symbols pointing forward to the atoning sacrifice of the Lamb of God. They were acts of faith, giving sinners a tangible way to express faith in the work of the coming Messiah. We often refer to these kinds of symbols as types, which are fulfilled by an antitype, or the appearance of the thing or event they foreshadowed. Some have even described the sacrifices as mini prophecies of the death of Jesus on the cross. The rituals associated with the sacrifice were a little like paying for a trip. When you purchase a train, bus, or airplane ticket, dear friends, you do not immediately receive the journey you paid for. Instead, you are given a ticket or boarding pass, a symbol or promise of the journey to come. You can sit on that piece of paper all you want, but it will not convey you to any destination. Once you have boarded on and the journey begins, however, you have received what you paid for, and the paper ticket becomes unnecessary. So it was with the sacrificial animals. They had an important role to play, but once the real sacrifice was made, they became meaningless. A reality depicted when the veil between the holy place and the most holy place in the earthly sanctuary was rent asunder at the death of Jesus. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. We read this in Mark 15, verse 38. The whole sacrificial system, dear friends, temple and all, pointed forward to the death of Jesus on the cross. Once Jesus fulfilled his promise at the cross and rose victorious over death, the tithes became unnecessary. Think about just how bad sin must be that only the death of Jesus, the incarnate word, see John 1 from verse 1 to 3 and verse 14, would atone for it. What should this tell us about what our attitude toward sin must be? A deep and relevant question, isn't it, dear friends? Let's move on to Tuesday. Well, the subtopic, the Passover lamb. The book of Revelation, dear friends, refers to Jesus as the lamb nearly 30 times. From the earliest days in the plan of redemption, God's people have used lambs as a symbol of the coming Messiah. Abel offered the firstborn of his flock as we read in Genesis chapter 4, verse 4. And before the Israelites departed Egypt for the land of promise, they were instructed to redeem every firstborn person or animal with a 1-year-old lamb. We read this in Exodus chapter 12, verse 5. I also encourage you, dear friends, to read also Exodus chapter 12 from verse 1 to 11, Isaiah chapter 53 from verse 7 to 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 7, and Revelation chapter 5 verse 6. What do these verses teach us about Jesus as the Passover sacrifice? What does that mean for each of us? Years after the death, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, Peter reflected on what had transpired and he wrote, knowing that you were ransomed from the future ways inherited from your forefathers, not with the perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. We read this in 1 Peter chapter 1 from verse 18 to 19. Jesus lived the one human life that satisfied the holiness of God. The rest of us have sinned, and the way we live our sinful lives quite literally tells lies about the nature of our Maker. Jesus, however, became the last Adam. 1 Corinthians 15, verse 45. When we had failed, he lived perfectly. In his humanity, he was everything the human race was supposed to be. He reflected God's glory perfectly. If you have seen me, he told Philip, you have seen the Father. John 14, verse 9. Jesus, meanwhile, was crucified on Passover, further demonstrating that he is the antitypical lamb. In John 18, verse 19 to 20, Jesus said that he spoke openly of his doctrine in a parallel way regarding the Passover lamb in Exodus 12, verse 5 to 6. The children of Israel were instructed to choose a lamb for Passover and keep it or put it on display during the days leading up to the sacrifice. When the high priest questioned Jesus about his teachings, Jesus made reference to the fact that he himself had been on open display in the temple for everybody to consider. His life, his works, his teachings all revealed who he really was. He is the Lamb without blemish, the most powerful expression of God's righteousness and glory. How can we better reflect the perfect character of Jesus in our lives? I want to get the difference. That's the most powerful question. How can we better reflect the perfect character of Jesus in our own lives as we discuss on this pertinent question? Let's move on to Wednesday. We have the subtopic Jesus at the temple. There is tension throughout the entire story of salvation. God wishes to restore the communion that we once enjoyed with Him and longs to draw close to us. But bringing sinners into His presence would destroy them. For you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness. David writes, nor shall evil dwell with you. We read this in Psalm chapter 5, verse 4. At the same time, David also writes, but as for me, I will come into your house in the multitude of your mercy. In fear of you, I will worship toward your holy temple. We read this in Psalm chapter 5, verse 7. Dear friends, read Haggai chapter 2 from verse 7 to 9. At the second temple being was being constructed, the prophet Haggai made an astonishing promise. The new temple would be more glorious than the previous one. So, dear friends, what was meant by that prophecy? Hmm? When the temple was dedicated by Solomon, the Shekinah glory, the presence of God that had accompanied the children of Israel en route to Canaan filled the temple. And so the priests could not remain to complete their work of ministry. We read this in 1 Kings chapter 8 from verse 7, from verse 10 to 11. When the second temple was dedicated, the Ark of the Covenant, representing God's throne, was missing because some faithful men, upset at the nation's sins, had hidden it. The literal presence of God did not fill the temple this time. It was heartbreaking. How could a guy's promise possibly come true? It was in the second temple that Jesus, the incarnation of God, appeared in person, in flesh and blood. God Himself had stepped out from behind the veil to become one of us and join us in this broken world. Because the Son of God was now the Son of Man, we would see His face, hear His voice, and witness, for example, when He touched an unclean leper and made him whole. See this in Matthew chapter 8, verse 3. Instead of bringing us closer in His direction, God brought us closer to Him by moving in our direction. He came down personally to us. No wonder the Bible said about Jesus, behold, the virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us, or in Shona, Munesu Ishe. Read this, Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. Think about what this means. The creator of the cosmos condescended not only to live among us, but to die for us. The cross is by far the greatest manifestation of God's love. What other ways, dear friends, we can see and experience the reality of God's love? Let's move on to Thursday. We have the subtopic, for you created all things. On a handful of occasions, prophets have been brought close. They have been brought close enough to God in vision that they were permitted to see God's throne. In Ezekiel saw it above the firmament. Read this in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 26. Isaiah visited the temple in heaven to see it. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. And in one of the most explicit descriptions provided to us, John was escorted there in vision in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. The Old Testament types in the sanctuary service indicated that there was only one path by which humanity would enter God's presence, the blood of Christ. See Leviticus 16, verse 2 and 14, for example. Read also Isaiah chapter 6, from verse 1 to 5, and Revelation chapter 4, from verse 7 to 11. What elements of these two visions are similar? Pay attention to the order of events. What subject is presented first? What comes next? What truth about God is being stressed in these visions? In each of these throne room visions, the first thing that happens is that heavenly beings underscore the holiness of God. Are we together, dear friends? In Isaiah's vision, the scene is impressive. The temple is filled with smoke, and the posts of the door were shaken as a seraphim proclaimed the holiness of God. In John's vision, cherubim make the same announcement: holy, holy, holy. See Ezekiel 10, verse 14 to 15, to find the living creatures described as cherubim. Each prophet was shown a dazzling scene of God's glory. Then was shown the prophet's reaction to the scene. Isaiah cries out that he is a man of unclean lips, Isaiah 6, verse 5. And John weeps because he is faced with the tragic truth that no one worthy can be found, Revelation chapter 5, verse 4. When we are directly presented with the worthiness of God, we then finally begin to comprehend the human situation. We are utterly unworthy, and we need Christ as our Redeemer. Satan has held many accusations against God, arguing that he is arbitrary, selfish and severe, but even a brief moment in God's throne room exposes Satan's lies. It is in seeing Christ for who he truly is, the Lamb who was slain, Revelation chapter 5, verse 12, that enables us to see the Father as he truly is. How comforting to know that by seeing Jesus, we see what the Father is like. John 14, verse 9. And the greatest revelation of what the Father is like is seen in Jesus dying on the cross for us. The cross then, dear friends, should show us two things. First, just how much God loves us, that he would sacrifice himself for us. Second, it should show us just how sinful and fallen we are, that only through the cross could we be saved. Are we together, dear friends? So, dear friends, the broken law of God demanded the life of the sinner. In all the universe, there was but one who could, in behalf of men, satisfy its claims. Since the divine law is as sacred as God himself, only one equal with God could make atonement for his transgression. None but Christ could redeem fallen men from the curse of the law and bring him again into harmony with heaven. Christ would take upon himself the guilt and shame of sin, sin so offensive to a holy God that it must separate the Father and his Son. Christ would reach to the depths of misery to rescue the ruined race. We read this in Patriarchs and Prophets, page 63 by Ellen G. White. Thank you, dear friends, for tuning in. May God bless you. Share this video to one and all so that many people may be reached with the gospel of salvation. Then the end will come. May God bless you. Thank you so much.